Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. In the comments on one of my philosophical/theological videos, someone had asked, what's the point of prayer? I mean, why would we bother asking God for things or to do things if God has already ordained the course of human history and he's going to do what he's going to do? I mean, it seems like at that point our requests wouldn't really matter. And so I wanted to take a minute to address this question. And the first thing I want to say is that I think it's a fair question. Christian churches almost universally accept the doctrine of the sovereignty of God, basically the idea that God is all-powerful, God is in control, nothing happens outside the scope of what God has ordained or allows. And so within that mentality, within that paradigm of the sovereignty of God, it's fair to ask, well, then how can my requests influence the future? But in answering this question, the first point that I would like to make is that the sovereignty of God does not preclude the free agency of man. As a simplistic illustration, think of like a computerized role-playing game where you have this character that you move through the game and make different decisions or solve puzzles or fight battles or whatever, and depending on what you do, you get different outcomes. You kind of move through this branching nonlinear story, and all of the possible outcomes of the story have been pre-programmed into the game by the programmer who is sovereign over the architecture of the software. But you or the character that you're controlling is still able to choose between different outcomes. Similarly, while the Bible makes it fairly clear that nothing can happen outside the scope of what God has ordained to be possible, the Bible also makes it fairly clear that God has ordained that humans will be held accountable for their actions, implying that our actions have consequences and therefore that humans have some measure of free agency or the ability to cause effects, to effect outcomes, to reap consequences for your actions. Now, different churches, denominations, and theologians will debate at length the question of exactly how much free agency God has ordained for mankind to have. What choices does God actually give us? Especially when it comes to the issue of salvation. Can you choose to be saved, or does God choose who's saved and who's not? That was the classic dividing point between Calvin and Arminius, and it remains a point of some debate among theologians today. And I don't really want to get off onto that tangent today. What I do want to do, though, is clarify that the actions that God allows us to take and the decisions that he allows us to make do influence the course of human history within the scope of possible outcomes or possible histories that God has ordained to be possible. Now, the second point that I would make in answering this question about prayer is that one choice or type of choice that God has given us is prayer. In just about any situation, you can choose to pray about it or not pray about it, at least as a believer. I guess there is some debate about whether or to what extent God will hear the prayers of unbelievers, but again, that's a tangential issue that we won't get into today. Again, as kind of a simplistic illustration, let's imagine for a moment that I was teaching a metal shop class. And I've already shown the students the basics of metalworking, how to use the machinery in the shop, and now they've got their own projects to work on for the remainder of the class. And so I've decided that, from this point forward, I'm not going to do any metalworking for them because I want them to get the hands-on experience of doing it themselves. unless they get to a point where they're stuck and they come to ask me for help. And then, I will show them what's next, or, especially if it was a project that maybe had certain steps that were outside the scope of what we covered, maybe I do end up doing something for them if they ask me to. Although if it's a student who's just lazy and is asking me to do his project for him, I'm still going to tell him, no, here's what you need to do, go do it. But either way, this illustrates how, we have, again, this branching storyline where I may or may not do anything for these students to help them with their projects, depending on whether or not they ask me for help. And so that in turn illustrates how our decisions to pray about something or not, to ask God for something or not, may sometimes affect what happens within the scope of what God has ordained. And given that the Bible says the effective fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, I would take that to mean that God has ordained significantly different outcomes for the choice of whether or not to pray for something or pray about something, at least in certain cases. So that is my primary answer to the question of what's the point of prayer if God has already decided what he's going to do, is that God has already decided what he's going to do, but it includes multiple options depending on certain decisions we make, especially on what we choose to pray about. So prayer can and does affect outcomes and the course of human history. Now, a secondary answer to the question of what's the point of prayer if God has already ordained everything that can happen is to point out that prayer is not just about getting God to do things for you. It also sets up this two-way dialogue between you and God that allows you to learn more about God and grow and develop in your relationship to him. For example, if you pray that God would provide something for you and he does, then you're much more likely to recognize his providence as such and be thankful for it than if you hadn't prayed about it and God still provided it anyway. Similarly, if you've been praying for something for a while and God hasn't provided it yet, then that begs the question of why. Are you praying for something that is outside the scope of what God is willing to allow? Or is he going to provide it for you, but just at a later time that somehow will be better for you? Or does he have a better idea entirely and he's going to provide something that's going to make what you're currently praying for totally irrelevant? And as you contemplate these questions and work through them as you observe what God does do in your life, this should lead you to a deeper understanding of the scope of things that God can use for good in your life. Anyway, those are the first two answers that came to my mind to the question of what's the point of prayer. Hope this helps, and until next time, thank you for watching The Idahoan Show.